Hello and welcome to the EURACTIV Agrifood Podcast. I'm Natasha Foote.
I'm Gerardo Fortuna.
I'm Julia Dahm.
And here's your weekly update on all things agriculture and food in the EU from EURACTIV's Agri-Food News team.
This week, we talk about the impact of the energy crisis on agriculture in the EU, the upcoming State of the Union address, solar panels on farms, and Brazilian liquor.
So welcome back, and particularly welcome back to Gerardo, who was missing last week. How does it feel to be back?
Well, it's actually, I feel home, no? Even though I'm not in the same room of yours, but yeah.
Very philosophical.
Well, we've missed you very much.
The space doesn't matter, someone would say. There must be a philosopher who said that, so.
You're mentally in this room with us.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, this week we're having a bit of a focus on, like everyone, I think, at the moment, everyone's talking about it, the energy crisis, which, of course, it impacts every single sector. We're seeing its impact, getting more and more everywhere, but it's especially impacting farmers now, and especially this week. So food producers have started really sounding the alarm over the impact that this crisis is having on them. And we had a couple of stories about this week. I spoke to, it was a fruit producer. So it's the harvest time right now for apples and pears in the EU. And that means we've got about 12 million apples and 2 million pears ready to be picked from the fields. And of course, they need somewhere to go. And normally
Other than our bellies.
Other than our bellies, or
before going into our bellies.
Eventually, hopefully going into our bellies. But at the moment, there's a lot of risk that actually these are going to go to waste they could go to waste because normally they have to go into cool storage. And of course, that takes a lot of energy. And so the small producers, especially the small producers, are just being hit with bills that are just absolutely impossible for them to pay. There was one Belgian farmer who was reporting that his annual €3,000 bill has skyrocketed to €50,000. So
it's massive. Oh my God.
Yeah, I don't know how you can be expected to, be faced with a bill like this. And of course, this is having a huge impact. They're now saying, not just this year, but also for next year, because they're saying, well, do we continue harvesting? Do we continue growing and planting into next year as well? Those are the big questions that are coming as well. So really hitting the sector, and they're not the only ones, because EU food companies are also now basically sounding the alarm that they're facing potential closure. They're talking about whether they have to either pause production and only, have production in maybe the lowest energy times, or stop production in the peak energy moments, or lay off staff, or, in the worst case scenario, some of them are already signaling they might even decide to go out of business or have to go out of business because of these mounting prices. So, obviously, again, the same thing, the first in the firing line are SMEs, especially those in very energy intensive sectors such as bakery, vegetable processing and dairy. So it's really starting to hit home, I think, for the European agri-food sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And another kind of turn of this gas and energy debate is the side of fertilizers, which we've been talking about a lot as well. In the area of fertilizers, there's basically a double problem of imports from Russia and Belarus, which are two very, very big exporters of mineral fertilizers to the EU. So these imports are basically, in the case of Belarus, they're sanctioned, so they aren't even allowed. And in the case of Russia, they're not part of the sanctions, but because no one wants to insure them, they're not coming in either. So basically, the EU market is missing a huge chunk of its usual supply of mineral fertilizers, which has been driving the prices for these fertilizers very high. And on top of this, production of mineral fertilizers is also very gas intensive. So even domestic producers are struggling to keep up with the extra demand that they're trying to cater to. And in the face of this, farmers this week called to scrap tariffs on basically all widely used types of mineral fertilizers. So they want imports to come into the EU tariff-free until 2024 in an effort to make prices a bit more bearable for farmers. But at the same time, which is very unusual, farmers are actually at odds on this with the fertilizer industry. Usually they're quite the team in calling for basically championing similar positions. But on this issue, they're actually quite at odds because while farmers have an interest in these tariffs on fertilizer imports being scrapped to lower prices for them, the domestic industry is very unhappy with this proposal.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's not, well, it's not that they're necessarily always aligned, but normally farmers and, industry
kind of a natural coalition.
Yeah, it's a natural
usually.
Coalition. It's they kind of work together. They normally see them at least in the same sphere of thinking. But in this respect, they're really pulling in completely opposite directions.
They're completely at odds because obviously for domestic producers, if you scrap tariffs on imports, it's going to be very difficult for them. And the director of Fertilizers Europe, one of the industry associations, told me that seeing as gas prices are several times higher in Europe than, say, in the US, 8 to 10 times higher, actually, this just puts European producers in an uncompetitive position. So if you open up the market to imports tariff-free, they're going to be crowded out of the market, basically. And this is actually an ongoing discussion because the Commission proposed a temporary scrapping of some tariffs back in July, namely urea and ammonia. So some inputs commonly used for producing nitrogen fertilizers, but the farmers are calling to extend this to all common types of fertilizers, basically. And next, it's in the hands of member states. We're going to discuss it next, so we'll see what they make of it.
And indeed, the energy topic and the impact of the energy crisis on the agricultural sector will be also one of the topics in the much-awaited State of the Union address that this week is going to be delivered by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in Strasbourg. As you know, every year the Commission President is setting the ambition of her administration in this speech that she's delivering in Strasbourg before MEPs. And last week on Friday, there was a special energy council to cope with to address the current energy crisis. And already in that energy council, there was something on the agriculture sector, as the fertilizer sector that Julia was mentioning before. In a non-paper of the Commission in which the EU executive were listing all the potential measures that they could take in order to cope with the current crisis. They mentioned also the possibility of, for instance, taxing the extra profits of fossil fuel companies who made big profits during the crisis. And this solidarity contribution should go to ease the burden of the energy-intensive sector, including, for instance, the fertilizer. So it was already discussed on Friday as a potential tool. And we also expect that the agri-food and particularly the food security issue will be mentioned by Ursula von der Leyen. Of course, you can follow the coverage on EURACTIV on Wednesday. We're going to have a live blog. We're going to have even a special podcast with our producer, Evie, with some comments by our experts on different policy hubs at EURACTIV. So we're gonna have plenty of time discussing what von der Leyen will say at this much-awaited speech. And at the same time, we spoke about food security. Food security is also will be again a topic of the Agrifish Informal Council, which will be actually on Friday. On Thursday there will be some visit because it's the informal in Prague, and I think that someone in this room actually is expected to be there.
Who could this be? It's true. The rumors are true. I'm going to be in Prague next week. I'm going to different farms and talking to different people there for the informal next week, because of course the State of the Union is not the only exciting thing happening next week.
Yeah, of course.
Potentially less people are excited about the Agrifish and the State of the Union, but still a highlight for us, I would say.
Very unfortunate.
I'm very excited. So
exactly, we'll make up for it
in enthusiasm.
And of course, as Gerardo mentioned, the main theme of this informal Agrifish, this meeting of agriculture ministers next week, will be food security. So ensuring food security, the role of EU agriculture and food in sustainable global food production. That's the kind of title of the discussions next week. So there'll be talks about the situation on agricultural markets. There'll be also some discussion about sustainability of food production. And also there'll be a little bit of a discussion about innovations and new trends in genomic techniques. So that's all coming up next week, but be sure to watch EURACTIV and we'll be reporting on that from Prague. You're listening to EURACTIV's Agrifood Podcast. Subscribe to our podcast newsletter on euractiv.com/newsletters. And if you want to expand your knowledge in other fields, you can also listen to our Digital Brief podcast and Beyond the Byline podcast. And if you have any comments or ideas, you can email us at podcast@euractiv.com.
So we've already talked quite a bit about the energy crisis today, and there's another angle that we haven't talked about as much, which is that obviously in the face of trying to phase out Russian fossil fuels in general as well, we're looking for alternatives, and of course primarily for renewable alternatives, including in the agri-sector, on site, on farms. And one of the options here are agri-solar panels, agri-PV. So basically solar panels on farms, which could basically help steer away from fossil fuels. But at the same time, this also touches on another current crisis that you've all heard a lot about, which is the food security crisis. Because of course, putting solar panels or renewable energy on farms also increases the pressure on agricultural land and the different uses, other than food production that it's used for. So I talked about this topic to an expert on agri-solar PV, Andreas Schweiger from the University of Hohenheim in southern Germany. And first up, I asked him to help us understand a bit what exactly we're talking about when we're talking about agri-PV. So let's listen to what he had to say.
So agri-PV or agri-photovoltaics, as it's also called, it's the idea of combining energy production with the production of food, so of crops or of vegetables, at the same place, on site or at the field scale on the field.
So could you walk us through what type of agriculture is actually possible combining solar panels with agricultural production? Is it possible for livestock, for crops?
I mean, of course, there's a lot of ideas right now in the room, and of course, there are also ideas of combining that with livestock. So combining, like having livestock stables combined with PV systems. Of course, all that might be possible under certain circumstances, but might be not possible under other circumstances. So for growing plants or for growing vegetables, there are of course plants which are better able to cope with these conditions, or even might profit from such kind of conditions. So with conditions, I mean that you of course have these systems, of course, cause shading below the system. So that means the plants will definitely have, or these systems will definitely have a negative effect on the plant's growth as they reduce the amount of light the plants get. But of course, under certain circumstances, these plants might profit, and some species might profit more than other species.
So would you say this is an opportunity facing the energy crisis that we currently got to supply an alternative source of energy, and also maybe to supply farmers with an additional source of income?
Obviously, it gained a lot of traction now with these energy crises, which is of course sad that we need at first a war, that people start really thinking about finding alternative ways of getting energy, getting more renewable energies into the system. But as I said, under circumstances, these systems might be really beneficial for farmers, not under every condition. So as I said, if you have shading, of course, that have negative impacts on plant growth. So you will probably have, under, let's say, modest conditions, when you have a lot of water available, you might have a negative effect on plant growth, thus on agricultural production. And but under other circumstances, and we are also, beside war, we are also experiencing a lot of climatic changes, and especially in Central Europe, we are experiencing more and more really heavy drought events. And under such kind of circumstances, so when we have really water shortage, such kind of PV systems and the reduction of light and thus also evapotranspiration might be really beneficial for plants growing underneath these systems. As I said, I don't think it's a general solution, and it can just be, I think, a part of the overall solution to get rid of fossil energy and find alternative sources. But I think it, especially for the combination of food production and energy production in the face of climate change, I think it's a really important part.
So that's interesting. So actually, you can use Agri-PV both for climate mitigation, so to curb the extent of climate change, and for climate adaptation, to make farms more resilient towards the impacts of climate change.
Exactly, yeah.
So do you see any risks as well to this technology? If you think about, for example, the pressures that we have on agricultural land being used for stuff other than farming food, especially in the context of the current food security crisis, do you think there's some trade-offs, some risks here as well?
Of course, it's an additional component of the use of landscapes, and definitely it provides an alternative pressure on agricultural land, but also on any other kind of land where you could put up such kind of systems. So it would definitely be a bad idea to just, without any knowledge, put up a lot of these systems or establish a lot of these systems. So as I said, under some circumstances it might be better, under others it might be not. So first of all, we kind of need a quite solid knowledge of under which circumstances it might be a good idea to implement such kind of systems on agricultural fields. As you said, we have not only these fields for producing energy, but of course we need these fields also for producing food. But as I said, in the face of climate change, there will definitely be circumstances under which such kind of systems will provide a double positive effect on food production as well as on energy production, renewable energy production.
So if you say that we need this knowledge about how we can combine solar PV with agricultural production and where it's possible, how far has science come on that? So where are we on that? Do we know in which areas in Europe, for example, this would work the best?
I mean, definitely it will be related to the amount of water we have available in the landscape. So the less water is available, the more scarce rainfall gets, the more important such kind of systems might get. But still, research has to be done. We are actively working on these topics, especially on these, as you said, climate change mitigation effects of agri-PV systems. But definitely we will, of course, this is what researchers always say, we need more research. So the interesting thing about this whole topic of agri-PV is that it became really chic to talk about that and to try to implement that as fast as possible because of different pressures we already heard about. So we really have to be careful that we do not implement something where we do not have solid knowledge on. So we really have to get fast in running our research to give as fast as possible solid recommendations where to implement such kind of systems and where not. And for this, of course, we need money. But so we are on the topic right now, and I think a lot of more research will come in the next years, which will help us to find the most optimal conditions under which such kind of systems will be beneficial for food production as well as for energy production.
So talking of money, could you help us understand a little bit how these solar panels work out financially for farmers? What are kind of the models that farmers sign up to? Do external companies put them up and then farmers get like a share of the profits, or is it farmers who own them? How can I picture this?
There are different possibilities, and both of them, which you mentioned, can be realized. So there are the cases where actually the farmer owns the system and thus gets the revenue from the energy production directly, as well as from the fruit production. But there are also cases where companies try or are about to implement such kind of systems on fields and then ask farmers to run the farming on these fields. I think the most challenging part of the implementation of such kind of systems, and I'm now talking about Germany, is actually the legal issue. So the legal framework for that is ways behind where we actually should be right now to start implementing such kind of systems in the landscape.
So a lot still to be done on the part of policymakers and researchers, really.
Exactly. Especially in the legal part, this has to be really pushed forward. Otherwise, we will have no chance to implement such kind of solutions in the landscape in the next years in a significant amount.
Thank you for the interview.
So for this week's flavour of the week, it comes all the way from Brazil. Ooh, I know, a bit more exotic than usual. And we're, as you said at the beginning, Julia, we're actually learning a little bit about a Brazilian liquor called Cachaça, which I can never pronounce properly. I'm not even sure I got it right that time. Anyway, I actually spoke to someone at a Cachaça distillery in Brazil where I was this summer. So let's learn a little bit more about what this alcohol is.
My name is Álvaro. I work in a cachaça factory. Mm-hmm. And cachaça is an alcohol made by the fermentation of the sugarcane. Started here in Brazil in the 1503. Mm-hmm. And it starts with slave things. When the Portuguese came here, they used slaves to make cachaça. Actually, it's not to make cachaça. They use the slave to make the sugar from the sugar cane. We call it molasses here. Okay. So the slaves use all the leftovers to fermentate that and drink that alcohol. And that was the born of the cachaça here in Brazil. Mm-hmm. In this factory, we ground the sugar cane. We take the juice to make a fermentation. It's always an organic fermentation. The fermentation is really quick. And then we distill it in 90 degrees to make the pure cachaça. Always we have to care about that drink because it has a lot of methanol. So we have a lot of controls with that. Mm-hmm. We have to make separations in different types of cachaças, like head of the cachaça, heart of the cachaça, the tail of the cachaça. But
Right. Do you also export this outside of Brazil, or is it
actually we are the newest factory here in Brazil, so we don't have enough production to export. But we work just with one guy in Germany. Okay. I think he works in Amsterdam and he has an online store. But we send just like 1% of all our production to him. But we just left here in Paraty. It's all consume just for
here. Okay.
Yeah. Because Paraty here, it's an historical. It's like a cachaça point. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of tourists. It's a touristic point. And there is a lot of people from Brazil who came here to take our products, our cachaça, and take from outside.
So it actually comes from Paraty.
Exactly.
Right. It was produced here,
It's produced here. Exactly. Was the first part in Brazil to create and sell the cachaça to outside.
And if you had to describe the flavor of it,
okay,
how would you describe it for the EU audience who've not tasted it?
Okay, the flavor it's like really similar to a rum. It's a really strong alcohol with a little bit the flavor of the sugar cane. So it has a non-sweet flavor, but with the flavor of the sugar cane. It's like hard to describe a pure alcohol. But
It's very good. I do enjoy it.
thank you.
And that's all from us this week. This week, the Agrifood Podcast is produced by EURACTIV's Agrifood team, Gerardo Fortuna, Natasha Food, and Julia Dam, with the technical support of our podcast producer, Evi Chiori.
You can also find this podcast on all major streaming platforms. That includes Apple, Amazon, Spotify, and Stitcher.
Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss the latest agricultural news in the EU. I'm Natasha Foot. Thanks so much for listening and see you next week.